I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we look at recent manufacturing delays in making ADHD medications, delays that have families struggling right before a new school year begins. But before that, this week, the state of Georgia charged former President Donald Trump and 18 of his allies, including former Mayor Giuliani, with crimes ranging from felony racketeering to conspiracy, all related to an attempt to overturn Joe Biden's 2020 victory there. In a recent opinion essay for the New York Times, senior Brookings fellow Norman Eisen explained how Georgia District Attorney Fani Willis's indictments contrast to special counsel Jack Smith's far narrow federal case, but both combine into something stronger and more affirming of our uniquely American judicial process. Mr. Eisen was special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee during Trump's first impeachment. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Norman, you wrote last February in another op-ed essay that the success is more likely assured in a simpler approach. The grand jury indictment is anything but simple. So where does that leave us focusing on a trial that Donald Trump may face sometime in a year from now or who knows when?
Sam, the beauty of the accountability landscape as we face it today is that it's far more favorable to seeing justice done than back in last February. That simple lane has now been occupied, and thank goodness. I actually also called for this in yet another essay in the Times by Jack Smith in the federal case. He has a laser-like focus on Trump. With that lane having been occupied, there was a great national need for some prosecutor to step forward and bring a case that was as full and as complex as the alleged conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election itself. And Fani Willis has done that with her case. If Jack Smith is Hemingway, lean, spare, nothing extra, Fani Willis is Dickens, giving us the full panoply of the characters, not just the alleged villains like Donald Trump, former Mayor Giuliani, and 17 others, but also the heroes who stood up to this, also Republicans. Brian Kemp, Brad Raffensperger, who features very prominently in the complaint, and others, Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor, now my CNN colleague, quite staunch conservatives, but standing up against, in my view, this cancerous autocracy that was represented by the attempted coup. So we have a balance of the simple and the complex, the federal and the state, the televised. Fani Willis will be televised, as I wrote in the Times. Jack Smith will not in federal court. The pardonable, Jack Smith could be have his case wiped out if Trump or another Republican takes office. Fani Willis cannot. So it represents a good balance between the two.
How does she keep the charges from being removed to the federal jurisdiction when he can claim, particularly for the federal officials, that they would be subject to federal charges already pending?
I have a new essay up at the Brookings Institution, my other home, besides the Times op-ed page, where I'm so honored to be to appear. And at Brookings, I explain why it's an extreme uphill fight for Mark Meadows, who's filed the initial removal petition. But I think for Trump, the third federal officer here is Jeffrey Clark, Trump's inside coup lawyer at the DOJ. I explain why it's an uphill fight for any of them to remove the case. Under federal law, You can only remove the case if the acts were undertaken within the official scope of your duties or if you have a colorable federal defense. The president, his chief of staff have no role to play in state election determinations. They don't get to choose who the voters of Georgia elect. And certainly there's no issue of an attempted coup being an official duty. Judge Amit Mehta, we used to practice law together, Judge Amit Mehta here in the District of Columbia has adjudicated these questions in a different posture in a civil case where Trump attempted to raise these arguments on an immunity defense and said that it does not meet the standard. Another attempted removal by Trump right in New York federal court. He tried to take his 2016 election interference case that Alvin Bragg is bringing, alleged falsification of documents to cover up hush money payments to prevent Trump from having another 2016 election scandal. He tried to remove that, and that was turned aside. So I think if you look at the law, you look at the facts here, removal is going to be an extreme uphill struggle. Very good judge has the Meadows case in the Northern District of Georgia, federal judge Steve Jones, an Obama appointee, very talented, very fair, even-handed. It could work, but I think it's really an uphill battle.
Everyone's entitled to a defense. Everyone is presumed innocent before found guilty. If you were defending Donald Trump and the other defendants in this case, how would you defend them?
I would attack the RICO claim, which is the core, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act. Georgia uses that. It's, as I wrote in the Times, conspiracy on steroids. It brings together so much conduct. I'd attack that and try to break it into pieces and say, you violated Georgia RICO law because you've combined too many unlike conspiracies. As I explained in my guest essay, there are 4 major conspiracies here, and I try to split them out. The problem is that Georgia RICO law is some of the most generous in the country, so I'd try, but I think that would fail. Number 2, I would bring a First Amendment argument that some of the speech that is charged in the complaint, Fonnie Willis pled that complaint more broadly than, charged the indictment, I should say, more broadly than Jack Smith did. He was very, very careful. Again, narrow versus broad. There's a need for that. So I'd attack on First Amendment grounds, but there's a good answer there, Sam, which is that the First Amendment does not protect criminal speech. You can't walk into the bank and say, stick them up, then get arrested, say, First Amendment, here's my pocket constitution, let me go. Third, I would argue advice of counsel, that everything Trump did, for example, the call to Brad Raffensperger on January 3rd, that's very important to this indictment. He was advised by his lawyers. I would push that. The problem is, if you and your lawyers know that the legal argument is absurd, then there's no basis to assert advice of counsel. You got to have a good faith reliance on counsel. And if your lawyers are your co-conspirators in crime, as is alleged here, that doesn't work either. And then finally, I would argue, hey, good faith reliance. I believed I won. Rudy Giuliani has already tried this. Hook me up to a lie detector test. But that's going to fail because this election had been counted, recounted, certified. The presidential electors had met, the real ones, they'd sent that to Washington, D.C. Trump can't come in on January 3rd, take the law into his own hands, no matter what he believes, Sam. That's vigilantism. To go back to my bank robbery, if I have litigated 62 times, Trump, of course, lost 62 cases nationally, that my bank owes me $11,780. And then after losing all those cases, I go in and I say, oh, I'm going to help myself. And I reach across the teller counter to take $11,780. What do you think is going to happen to me? I'm going to be criminally prosecuted, arrested, tried, and convicted. So the arguments are there. They're serious arguments. They'll be taken seriously, but I believe they'll fail ultimately.
Norman Eisen, given the number of counts in this indictment, given the number of people indicted, given the number of witnesses, are we going to live to see this case come to trial?
Well, you certainly will live to see the case come to trial. Whether it comes to trial in the time frame that Fani Willis has requested of March 2024, just 3 weeks before Alvin Bragg's case is currently set for trial in Manhattan, remains to be seen. I feel pretty confident that there'll be at least a little slippage. You could see the case severed, chopped into pieces by the judge, say, look, I'm going to take the federal defendants first. Someone would have to move for severance. There's ways that the case might end up slightly contracted. You could see their defendants have a speedy trial right, so under Georgia law, and they may insist on that. I do think we'll see the trial of this case, whether it'll be before or on or in March of 2024 is another matter. But you could well get it during 2024 or in 2025. And it's okay if it slips to 2025, as long as Jack Smith can try his case for the same conduct federally. Because this case is, as I started, the pardon insurance. Trump or another Republican could pardon or the federal cases, or simply come in and order DOJ to drop the cases. We can't have that. So this case is pardon insurance. It will continue. So if it slips later into 24, into 25, it still has that value.
A quick last question. What about justice for Shane Moss, Ruby Freeman, the election workers who were so maligned in all of this?
This case is very important because it sends the message that the offenses against the election workers, and those offenses are in the criminal case, there will be consequences. There was a large conspiracy that included targeting them that is alleged. And if Fani Willis proves the case, people will go to jail for targeting those election workers. It sends an important message. They have a separate libel lawsuit against Rudy Giuliani that also will represent a measure of justice, although it looks like he may not be in very good position to pay. They and their lawyers are going to pursue that. So we have a 1-2 criminal civil punch. I think that is one of the most important aspects for Ruby, for Shea, but for our election workers everywhere, Sam, to know that you cannot bully, harass, and intimidate them without consequences. With Fani Willis's case, the consequences are beginning.
Norman Eisen of Brookings and opinion columnist in the New York Times, thanks so much for joining us. The collateral damage of ADHD medication shortages coming up next. As summer winds down, preparations for the new school year begin. Parents across the country are struggling to find pharmacies with ADHD medication in stock. Joining me now to explain what's causing the current delays, how parents and kids are coping, New York Times mental health reporter Christina Caron. Christina, why are there shortages of that kind of medication now? And as you point out in the Times, this has been going on for months, even a year.
Absolutely. This is the question that is top of mind for all of the doctors and the families that I spoke with. Why is this happening? When is it going to end? And unfortunately, the answer is not simple. The problems affecting the pharmaceutical supply chain are complex and unfortunately, frustratingly opaque. What we probably would need an investigative piece just to examine that, to be honest. But what we do know is that in August, the DEA and the FDA had issued a joint letter that had explained that they would like the manufacturers to up their production of stimulants. Now, because these stimulants for ADHD are controlled substances, they are tightly regulated, and a manufacturer has to approach the DEA with the amount they want to produce for the year, and the DEA will approve it or deny it. They're saying that the manufacturers are producing 1 billion doses fewer than they're permitted to make as a whole. I went to the manufacturers and I asked them, is this true? Are you producing less than your quota? Why, if so, why is that happening? Some of the manufacturers who got back to me actually said, we actually are meeting our quota. One producer of generic Adderall told me they're requesting more quota from the DEA. So I asked the DEA, do you have a sense of why this is happening? And they just referred me back to the manufacturers and said, information about quotas is considered confidential. So we're kind of going in circles
Sounds
here.
like the runaround.
trying to figure this out. Now, if you look at some of the reasons why these manufacturers say they're in shortage right now, you will see things like shortage of active ingredient listed on the FDA drug database. You'll see things like manufacturing delay. And when I contact the manufacturer, this is actually the case with Vivance, 2 of their capsules are under a manufacturing delay. They would not specify what that meant, only to say that the quality of the drug was not being affected. So it's really tough to try to get to the bottom of it, but it does appear, based on what I heard from the manufacturers, that it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And this is unusual from other kinds of shortages in the past. There have been ADHD medication shortages. They've been short-lived, usually involving one facility for a particular reason. This is unique in that it's lasted almost a year and it's involving a lot of different manufacturers. So I think it's really important that we get more transparency in understanding what's happening in the supply chain, and also that generic manufacturers can start to focus on reliability rather than mostly cost cutting, because knowing that these medications are reliably available is incredibly important to these families.
And as you pointed out in the Times, demand is going up at the same time.
That's right. That's right. Demand has been increasing for these drugs, and we can see that looking at prescription data. It was especially true during the years of the pandemic, when we saw a jump among certain age groups, particularly women. Interestingly, between 20 and 24, there was a big jump there of, I think, up to 20% between 2020 and 2021 of stimulant prescription fills. So that's an issue, and I know the DEA and the FDA have both expressed concern, along with other groups, that there is some abusive practices going on, where sometimes people are being prescribed medications they may not actually need, or people are abusing the medications. There can be diversion, where someone is selling it to someone else who never got a prescription in the first place. And there were some telehealth companies during the pandemic, Cerebral is one that comes to mind, that are being investigated right now for potentially unethical prescribing practices. But although that may be the case some of the time, ADHD is also undertreated in certain populations. So there are certain kids and also adults who are not actually getting the medications that they need, were never treated in the first place for their condition. ADHD is actually the most common neurodevelopmental disorder among kids. It's thought to affect about 6% of children. So and unfortunately, girls and people of color, and also those who identify as LGBTQ, tend to receive treatment less often than other groups.
How do we identify people who have it? I mean, we've heard people are being overdiagnosed, people are being over-medicated. How do we know someone has that as opposed to just being bored or, unruly? How do we know they have an attention deficit disorder or something that falls within that spectrum?
That's a really good question. I think, like a lot of other conditions, there are gradations to the severity with which you might experience symptoms. The people who are supposed to be taking medications for ADHD have a more severe form, such that they cannot function in their daily life without it. And so this isn't a case of a student needing to maybe get an A on a test instead of a B, who needs to just ramp up their focus a little bit in class. These are kids who are having a lot of trouble regulating their emotions, who are very disorganized, and who are sometimes very inattentive. It can be a lot of kids are hyperactive, and it's to the extreme that they have trouble maintaining their relationships. One child I described in the article, when he was off his Adderall, literally ran out of his classroom, to chase a squirrel outside in the courtyard. These are more extreme behaviors that, when he is on his medication, are not happening.
And is this a problem in terms of the shortage with generic drugs or brand name drugs as well?
It's at this point mostly generics. Vyvanse is not yet in generic form because it's a newer medication. That one is in shortage with 2 capsules specifically, but most of the shortage is generics. However, families say that they have some difficulty finding the brand name too. When I spoke with Johnson & Johnson, for example, or Janssen, I should say, they told me they make the brand name Concerta, and they told me there is no shortage of Concerta. But the issue is that a lot of pharmacies don't stock it because it's not covered by most insurance plans. So if you wanted to get brand name Concerta, you could potentially call your pharmacy and ask them to
But it's pretty expensive.
But then you're also paying potentially hundreds of dollars. So it's a huge difference in price. There is one family who would typically get generic Concerta. They haven't been able to find it. They switched to Vyvanse. So now they're paying about $50 more a month. For some families, that wouldn't be possible. For them, they're able to do it. But families are having to make, and doctors are having to make these difficult decisions to either switch medications entirely, to use a different formulation, sometimes to switch to a different dosage and sort of try to Frankenstein the prescription so that it most matches what they used to have.
And as you wrote, this, as kids are looking forward to school or not, this affects their self-esteem when they go to school, how they perform.
Yes. When you're being constantly reprimanded by a teacher, or you're getting in fights with your friends because you're having trouble regulating your emotions, also fighting with siblings, that's a common thing I heard. It can be really disruptive. It has a ripple effect. So it's affecting not only the child, but they know, they're very smart. They know that it's affecting the classroom, it's affecting their family life. They're struggling to do what they think they need to do in order to succeed at school, and they're failing, and that is going to take a toll on you after a while. You're going to start to feel like you're just not good enough. I'm just not actually smart after all. One parent told me her daughter feels that way about herself, even though these kids actually test really high on IQ tests. They're very intelligent, but those things can kind of avalanche into the sense that I'm not as worthy as some of my other peers.
Christina Caron from the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on the metamorphosis of our former mayor. I've known Rudy Giuliani for more than 50 years. He used to be my lawyer at the Daily News. Later, when he was a federal prosecutor and mayor, and I was a reporter and editor, he was a news source, a fairly reliable, if self-serving one, until he lied. He told a trusted colleague of mine what he planned to do next during his investigation of municipal corruption. The article about his plans made the next day's front page. That same day, Rudy didn't say he had gotten carried away. He didn't say he made a mistake. He didn't apologize. He publicly and unequivocally denied having revealed his plans in the first place. You ask if Giuliani has changed. The answer is he's gotten worse. He was always a zealot, which maybe was what made him the right man at the right time. He disrupted organized crime. He sent a message to Wall Street, perhaps too loud, but clear. He proved New York City was governable, whether or not you liked the way he governed. But near the end of his third term, something snapped. He announced on TV that he was seeking a legal separation from his wife. He admitted to me what Wayne Barrett had written in a scathing biography, that he had known his father had a criminal record. He was justifiably redeemed after 9/11 by a striking, if brief, display of grace and empathy that promoted him to America's mayor, only to plummet in 2008 from a frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination to a miserable fifth-place finish with less than 3% of the primary vote and not a single delegate. It was downhill from there, a slippery slope, as Andrew Kurtzman recalled recently in the Times, of drinking, divorce again, and a revived mutual admiration relationship with Donald Trump. Rudy's trajectory may not have had the inevitability of his favorite film, The Godfather, but it is careening toward a finale familiar to fans of his preferred form of entertainment, opera. His favorite, The Marriage of Figaro. No wonder. It's the tale of a nobleman unexpectedly forgiven for transgressions ranging from infidelity to the abuse of power. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.